Picture a cliff face 40 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, carved with 14 stone niches, each one housing a statue of a god: Pan, Hermes, Nemesis. At the base of the cliff, a cave so deep and dark that the people of the region called it the entrance to the underworld. A great spring once poured from inside it, and the roar of the water mixed with the smoke of sacrifices and the sound of ritual prostitution in the courtyards below. A white marble temple to Caesar Augustus gleamed on the platform above. This is Caesarea Philippi. This is where Jesus took his disciples and asked the most important question in the history of religion. Not in the temple courts of Jerusalem, not on the shores of Galilee. In the shadow of a pagan shrine, surrounded by the full portfolio of what the ancient world called divine, Jesus turned to 12 Jewish men from the north and said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered. And what Jesus said next has divided Christianity for 2,000 years. Every denomination traces something about its own authority back to this conversation. Catholics read it as the founding charter of the Papacy. Protestants read it as a statement about faith itself. Orthodox Christians read it as a description of collegial leadership in which no single bishop rules above all others. All three traditions claim the words of Jesus in Matthew 16 as their cornerstone. All three cannot be right in the same way, and yet almost nobody actually goes back to the text with fresh eyes and asks the hardest question. What did the earliest Christians actually believe about Peter's authority? And does any of it resemble what later became the papal office? That is what this video is about. Not which version of Christianity is correct. That question is larger than any single video can carry. But something more specific and more historically urgent. What can we actually know about Peter's role, about the meaning of that famous conversation in Caesarea Philippi, and about how the early church understood the Bishop of Rome's authority? Because the evidence is far more complicated, far more interesting, and far less settled than either side of this debate usually admits. To read Matthew 16 well, you have to start with the language. Jesus, in that region, would almost certainly have been speaking Aramaic, not Greek, and in Aramaic the word for rock is kepha, one word. No grammatical gender distinction. When Jesus said, "You are kepha, and on this kepha I will build my church," it was a single clean statement, a pun, direct and unmistakable. You are rock. On this rock I will build. The Greek creates the complication, because Greek does have grammatical gender, and when Matthew renders the Aramaic into Greek, he uses two slightly different forms. Simon's new name becomes petros, masculine, because you cannot name a man with a feminine noun. The word for the foundation rock becomes petra, feminine, and for centuries, Protestant interpreters seized on this distinction, arguing that Jesus was not referring to Peter at all. He called Peter petros, a small stone. The foundation rock was petra, something else entirely, usually identified as Peter's confession or as Christ himself. The problem is that this argument does not hold up to scrutiny. Non-Catholic Greek scholars, including Oscar Cullmann, the distinguished Swiss New Testament scholar, have been explicit. In first-century Greek, petros and petra were used as synonyms. The distinction between a small detached stone and a massive bedrock existed in classical Greek poetry centuries earlier, but by the time the New Testament was written, that distinction had blurred. Cullmann's own words were direct. The idea that Jesus was contrasting Peter with the rock rather than identifying him as the rock is, in his phrase, quite inconceivable from the Greek. The French language never had this problem. Pierre means both Peter and rock, one word, no ambiguity. The French-speaking church read Matthew 16 for 1,500 years and never generated the same controversy. So the linguistic case for Peter being the rock on which Jesus said he would build his church is stronger than Protestant tradition often acknowledges. Let me say that plainly as an interpretive position. The grammar and context of Matthew 16 most naturally identifies Peter as the foundation reference. What that means for institutional succession is a separate and much harder question. But the text itself is pointing at the man. Now look at what Jesus actually gave him. He said, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." This is not a casual phrase. The word keys carries a specific echo for any first-century Jewish listener. In Isaiah 22, the prophet describes a corrupt royal steward named Shebna being stripped of his office. God replaces him with a man named Eliakim, and the text says, "I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens no one can shut, and what he shuts no one can open." The key to the house of David was not a decoration. It was carried on the shoulder of the royal steward, the chief official of the king's household, second only to the king himself, the one who controlled access to the throne. When Jesus speaks of keys to his disciples, the imagery is drawn directly from this. He is describing a stewardship role, an authority that is real administrative, and delegated. In the Jewish framework Jesus was operating within, this is the vocabulary of a prime minister, not a constitutional monarch. But here is the detail that almost every commentary skips past. In Matthew 18 verse 18, Jesus says essentially the same thing again, but not to Peter alone. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. The second-person pronoun in Matthew 18 is plural. He is speaking to all the disciples. The binding and loosing authority that Jesus granted in Matthew 16 to Peter is granted in Matthew 18 to the entire apostolic community. This does not erase the singular moment of Peter's naming, but it complicates any reading that treats Peter's authority as categorically different in kind from the authority of the other apostles. The book of Acts shows us what Peter's authority actually looked like in practice, and it looks like leadership, not supremacy. He speaks first at Pentecost. He addresses the crowd when the lame man is healed. He is the one who pronounces judgment on Ananias and Sapphira. When the Jerusalem church needs to understand what is happening with Gentiles, it is Peter's vision of the clean and unclean animals that opens the door. At the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, Peter speaks with decisive weight, but notice what Acts also shows. James, not Peter, delivers the binding judgment at the Jerusalem Council. The final formulation of the apostolic decree comes from James's lips. There is no indication that Peter overrules him or that anyone expected him to. The leadership structure of the early Jerusalem church looks collegial, not monarchical. Peter is first among the apostles in the sense that a captain is first among officers. The captain does not replace the council. The most theologically explosive piece of evidence comes not from Acts, but from Paul. In Galatians 2, Paul describes an incident at Antioch. Peter had been eating with Gentile believers freely, but when certain men arrived from James in Jerusalem, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those of the circumcision party. And Paul's response was not to appeal to Peter's authority. It was to oppose him to his face, publicly, before the entire community. I opposed him to his face, Paul writes, because he was clearly in the wrong. Let that settle. If Peter held the kind of infallible supreme authority that later papal theology would claim, Paul's public confrontation of him on a matter of gospel substance would be incoherent. You do not correct the Pope in front of the congregation. You do not describe the Vicar of Christ as clearly in the wrong. The Antioch incident is not a minor embarrassing footnote. It is a first-century document in which one apostle treats another as a peer who can err and be called to account. Now move forward one generation. Around the year 96, a letter was sent from the church in Rome to the church in Corinth. The Corinthians had removed some of their appointed elders, and the Roman church was weighing in, urging restoration and proper order. This letter is known as First Clement, and it is the earliest Christian document outside the New Testament that survives. For Catholic apologists, First Clement is powerful evidence for early Roman primacy. Here is Rome, writing with apparent authority to another church, intervening in their internal affairs. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing about 80 years later, confirms the letter's impact, describing it as a most powerful epistle. But read the letter itself carefully. It is written in the first-person plural, not from Clement, Bishop of Rome, from the Church of God that sojourns at Rome, to the Church of God that sojourns at Corinth. The author does not invoke Peter's succession. He does not claim jurisdictional authority. He never uses the word pope. He writes as a concerned brother church urging repentance. The letter is morally authoritative in the way a wise older sibling's advice carries weight. It is not legally binding in the way a papal decree would later be. Those are two entirely different kinds of authority, and the difference matters enormously. Then there is Ignatius. He is the man who invented the word Catholic. He is dying for the faith. He has more reason than anyone alive in his generation to state clearly what the structure of the church is, and he does, relentlessly. In 6 of his 7 letters he hammers the same point: obey your bishop. The bishop is the center of the community. Nothing happens without the bishop. He builds his entire theology of church order on episcopal authority. His 7th letter is to Rome, and in it he praises the Roman Church extravagantly. Presides in the bond of love, he calls it, worthy of God, worthy of honor. Then he asks them not to prevent his martyrdom, and that is essentially all. He never commands the Romans to obey their bishop. He never names a monarchical bishop in Rome at all. The one letter where episcopal authority would matter most, if Rome were already the supreme see, and Ignatius goes silent on the subject. Several scholars, including Karl Donfried and Peter Richardson in their analysis of early Roman Christianity, have concluded that this silence is not accidental. As late as the early 2nd century, Rome may not yet have had a single monarchical bishop. It may have been governed by a council of presbyters, a college of elders, with no single figure holding supreme local authority. The man who coined the word Catholic did not write to a pope, he wrote to a community. Rome had prestige, enormous prestige, but prestige and jurisdiction are not the same thing. They never were. The figure who begins to close the distance between those two categories is Pope Damasus I, who held office. Damasus was the first bishop of Rome to claim explicitly that Rome's primacy rested on Peter, and the first to use the phrase, the Apostolic See, to describe the Roman Church. He was operating in a specific political context. Constantinople had just been elevated as the new Rome, and the Eastern churches were claiming growing status. Damasus needed a theological argument that no Eastern bishop could match, and he found one in apostolic succession from Peter. It was Damasus who convened the Synod of 382 that formally pronounced Rome's primacy. The Eastern bishops refused to attend. Then came Leo I, Bishop of Rome from 440 to 461. Leo was one of the most formidable minds and personalities in the history of the Western Church. He articulated a fully developed theology of Petrine succession. Peter did not die, Leo wrote. Peter speaks to Christians through his successors. What the Bishop of Rome says, Peter says. The office inherits the promise. Leo's theology was persuasive in the West. The Eastern churches tolerated it when it was useful and rejected it in practice when it was not. By the time the Council of Chalcedon met in 451, the Eastern bishops were willing to call Leo's doctrinal letter a touchstone of orthodoxy, but they also passed Canon 28, giving the Bishop of Constantinople equal honor to Rome. Leo's legates protested. The Eastern Church proceeded anyway. The two versions of primacy were already diverging. Here is where the historical argument deserves the most honest examination. Cyprian of Carthage, who died in the year 258, is one of the most frequently quoted figures in debates about early papal authority. Catholic apologists cite his language about the chair of Peter and the principal church as evidence that the 3rd century church recognized Roman supremacy, but Cyprian's own behavior tells a different story. When Pope Stephen I tried to override an African council's decision on the rebaptism of heretics, Cyprian refused. He held an assembly of 87 African bishops, and they issued a declaration: no bishop should set himself up as bishop of bishops, or by tyrannical terror compel his colleagues to the necessity of obedience. That is, Cyprian, the man who called Rome the chair of Peter, explicitly rejecting the idea that any bishop could exercise universal jurisdiction. Geoffrey Dunn, in a thorough academic study of Cyprian's interactions with the bishops of Rome, concluded that Cyprian viewed Rome as a prestigious and influential center, but not as holding jurisdictional primacy over churches outside its own province. His ecclesiology was collegial. Synods and letter writing, not papal decree, were how the church made binding decisions. This is the pattern that repeats across the first 4 centuries. Genuine respect for Rome, real acknowledgement of its historic importance, but no agreement that the Bishop of Rome could override the decisions of other bishops in their own regions. The doctrine of papal infallibility was not formally defined until the First Vatican Council in 1870. Before that definition, believing in papal infallibility was not required of Catholics. A 1860 Catholic catechism used in English schools treated the idea of papal infallibility as a Protestant invention, calling it no article of the Catholic faith. The definition of infallibility emerged in a specific political crisis. The papal states were being absorbed into the unified Italian kingdom, the temporal power of the papacy was collapsing, and the definition of doctrinal infallibility was partly an assertion of spiritual authority to compensate for the loss of territorial control. That historical context does not make the definition false, but it does mean the definition was not simply the retrieval of something universally taught from the beginning, it was a development, a significant one. So here is where we have to name what the evidence actually allows. Peter was given a unique role in the New Testament. His naming, his commission, his position in Acts, the singular weight of Matthew 16, these are not inventions of later Catholic theology. They are in the text. Peter is genuinely first among the apostles in a way that none of the others are, and the metaphor of the keys carries real institutional implications. The church in Rome was genuinely important from very early. Its connection to both Peter and Paul, the two most foundational figures outside of Jesus himself, gave it a natural prestige no other church could match. When early churches had disputes, they sometimes wrote to Rome. When early theologians needed to establish orthodox tradition against heresy, they pointed to Rome as a touchstone. This is historical fact. But the specific claims of universal jurisdiction, of infallibility, of a single bishop whose authority supersedes all councils and all other bishops by divine right, these are not simply what the early church believed. They are the result of a long, contested, theologically rich, politically influenced development that took centuries to reach its current form. The Orthodox churches, which kept the collegial model, are not making up an alternative tradition. Cyprian of Carthage was not a Protestant anti-deum. Ignatius of Antioch was not confused about what he believed. The picture they collectively represent, a church in which Rome has genuine honor and genuine influence, but not unchallengeable universal jurisdiction, was a real and coherent ecclesiology that had deep roots in the earliest centuries. There is a question underneath all of this that is larger than the historical argument. It is the question of what authority is for. When Jesus gave Peter the keys and described the binding and loosing power, he did not say, "so that you may rule." He said it in the context of a community, a gathering of people, an ecclesia, the Greek word for an assembly, a group called together for a purpose. The authority was instrumental. It existed to serve the community's life, to open the kingdom to those who came seeking it, to maintain the integrity of the teaching against distortion. When Leo I held firm at Chalcedon against the heresy that divided the natures of Christ, that was the keys working as they were designed to work. When the same office pronounced that Galileo's astronomy was heresy, or that certain populations had no souls, or signed concordats with political tyrannies, those were the keys used as a weapon for something else entirely. The Protestant reformers of the 16th century were not wrong that something had gone badly wrong. They were often wrong about what had gone wrong, reading the Church's failures back into the founding texts and concluding that there should be no institutional authority at all. But the corruption they saw was real, and the Catholic response, which was partly to double down and define authority more sharply rather than reform it more genuinely, produced its own problems, including the very definition of infallibility in 1870, that drove the old Catholic schism and made reconciliation with the Orthodox world harder rather than easier. The story of Peter and the Papacy is not a story of simple continuity from Caesarea Philippi to Vatican City. It is a story of a real foundation, genuinely gifted authority, genuine early prestige, and then a long and contested development in which institutional ambition, theological creativity, political pressure, and sincere theological conviction all played their parts. Here is what I find genuinely moving in all of this. Peter himself, the man, not the office, is one of the most fully human figures in all of ancient literature. He got it spectacularly right at Caesarea Philippi. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." 6 verses later, he got it spectacularly wrong, and Jesus called him Satan to his face. He walked on water for 3 steps and then sank. He swore he would die before denying Jesus, and then denied him 3 times before sunrise. He was corrected publicly by Paul in front of the entire Antioch church. And yet, after the resurrection, when the disciples went back to fishing because they did not know what else to do, it is Peter who jumps from the boat and swims for shore when he sees Jesus standing on the beach. It is Peter who, when asked 3 times whether he loves Jesus, 1 for each denial, says yes 3 times, and each time Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." The authority given to Peter was not given to someone who had earned it. It was not given to the most qualified man in the room. It was given to the man who failed most publicly and was most publicly restored, which suggests that the authority Jesus described at Caesarea Philippi was never meant to rest on the merit of whoever held it. It was always meant to be an office of service, accountability, and perpetual recommissioning by the one who gives it. The question that the Peter debate raises for every Christian tradition is not just which church has the right structure. It is, does the structure actually feed the sheep? Does it open the kingdom or close it? Does it serve or does it demand service? 2,000 years of church history is a very long answer to a question that was first asked beside a cliff full of pagan gods, by a Galilean carpenter who named a fisherman after a rock and told him that even the gates of the underworld would not stand against what was about to be built. The gates of Hades have not prevailed. That much, at least, every tradition agrees. If questions like this one keep you up at night, the kind of historical and theological questions that your Sunday school class never had time to answer, share this video with someone else who is asking the same things. The conversation is worth having.